Sten, we're live.
Wow. Let me cool down a little bit here. Now, welcome to In the Dugout. Mike Stenhouse here. I hope you appreciate you got such a multitasking host. I just got off of 52 minutes on the air with Dan York, respected colleague, I guess, in the media now that I'm doing this. He just tried to excoriate me for 52 minutes on his show for reasons I still can't comprehend, for unreasonable reasons. I don't even understand why he didn't understand what I was saying. So one of us is completely missing the boat. Was it him? Was it me? But here we are. Good thing I'd done some show prep earlier in the day on this. I just don't, I see Louise commenting on the comment. I don't know why Dan was so angry. I don't know. I purposely provoked him a little bit after he provoked me. He said we lost credibility and too bad we don't have it anymore like we used to have. He said that on social media. And I responded, well, let's talk about it. And then on the air said, maybe it's you, Dan, that's changed. Maybe you're not accepting alternative views anymore. And then he just went off. And then, of course, he's defending McKee, who we know is a good friend of his. But I've heard him be critical of McKee, too. So I don't know. Dan's always been fair to me. Let me say, I appreciate the fact he had me on. I was on for 50 minutes. It's not like he stabbed me behind the back or anything, right? He had me on. He didn't seem to understand what it was I was trying to say. And all I'm trying to say is, when McKee, Raimondo, Alexander Scott, anyone in our state government or federal government for that matter, impose these mandates and say that it's based on the science or based on what the experts say, if you want us to have confidence in those mandates and those decisions and those policies, then you damn well better tell us, what are those studies? What is that data? Who are those experts? Don't just say, oh, yeah, I talked to a whole bunch of people and the data show. What data? What people? And then we, like lemmings, just sit back and let it all be. Well, I'm not going to sit back and let it all be. And I thank God we have Dr. Andrew Boston, who will be on this show in about a half hour. I'm sure this is what we'll be talking about. His name was invoked today. Some idiot reporter at the press conference today. Oh, there's a bunch of doctors. There's a doctor running around saying that mask mandates don't work. What do you say to that?
Stan, I believe Dan York called him Boston Schmostum. I think I heard that on air.
Today?
Yes, today when you guys were...
Boston Schmostum. All right, so this is what I don't get. See, we're injecting... through Dr. Boston, who, like me, is taking a contrarian view to this whole COVID lockdown restriction mandate thing. But we very professionally put together credible research, citing gold star reports, citing actual Rhode Island data, and drawing highly reasonable conclusions. Yet because, and this is the cancel culture, this is a microcosm. What happened with me and Dan York is a microcosm of exactly what's happening in our society today. But because that research and because those conclusions and opinions countered the status quo, those in government and those who defend the government in the media, in big tech, in the advocacy groups, they turn on us and call us the crazy people and call us and try to cancel us or diminish our opinions when all we're doing is putting forth credible information that every governor, every public official, every person, every organization should consider and consider strongly. And we cite our sources and we cite the data that led us to draw those conclusions and opinions. This government in this state refuses to do that. Governor Rundle, Director Scott, and now Governor McKee. Oh, just the science. It's the science. It's the data. It's people. What data? What science? What people? Otherwise, you're not going to have public confidence in the decisions you make. Is that such a hard notion to understand? We are a research-based organization. We put forward the research, and from that research, we draw our opinions. Now, it's the same thing with economics. This isn't, I mean, first of all, we hear the same thing with all the climate change alarmists. Oh, the science says, well, what science? Show us the science. Show us any town that's been flooded out of existence. Show any people who have been incinerated. You know, this mild climate change, whatever it's been in the end of the last century, actually helped us grow more food and crops throughout the world. It's not a catastrophe, but yet they refuse to share that kind of data with you. In fact, they have to rig the data to try to make their argument. Same thing with the economy. It's just this notion that if government spends a lot, it's not going to impact the economy. It's not going to impact employers and job producers. If we raise energy costs, like we're going to discuss with our first guest coming up in about 5 or 6 minutes, Chris Carlosi from the National Federation of Independent Businesses. He represents the largest group, or he's one of the largest groups of businesses in the state, over 500 in this state. Narratives are opinions. Narratives are not history. Narratives are not research. Narratives often are fake. And in this country and in this state, public policy is being made based on false narratives. And they don't even deign to give us the data or the science. At least they don't even try to give us the data or science, fake as it might be, to back up their policies so that we can say, wait a minute, that data is not credible. Or maybe we'll say, hey, you know what? He's got a point there, the governor. That's some pretty damn good research right there. Maybe we ought to go along with this. But they don't do that. They don't do it in economics. They're not doing it with COVID. They don't with climate change. They don't do it with healthcare. This is, now we talk about woke and narratives. A few years ago, and I've always said, I called it, it's the same thing, political correctness. I said it was one thing when political correctness, wokeism, government narratives, it's one thing when those were just funny opinions, fringe opinions that we laughed at and discussed at the water cooler or at the dinner table. But now, gullible public officials, gullible corporate CEOs, and many others are making massive decisions that impact so many millions of people based on these false narratives without supplying the rationale behind it or the guts, the data behind it. This can't persist. And this is what we are here to do. This is what we try to expose on this show. Dan York used to get it. Dan York used to be a contrarian to government. He's still a great talk show host. He's provocative. He was certainly provocative today, and it's a good thing I'm a big enough man. I can take the arrows. I have thick skin. It doesn't bother me. If you listened, I kept my cool. I pushed back, of course, but I kept my cool and I kept to the point, and I made a great, I think, concluding remark today. Listen to it on Dan. He's probably out there criticizing me right now. I'm not going to criticize him. I appreciate the fact he brought me on the show for 50 minutes and at least at the end allowed me to get our research out there. These are the kind of debates we need to have, and they need to be spirited. We need to disagree. The people need to hear this so they can make up their own minds. Well, if you agree with Dan, fine. If you agree with me, fine. But at least people should hear both sides of this stuff. And just hearing from one compromised set of medical officials, like I believe Governor McKee is doing and Governor Raimondo did, without looking at the broader research that's out there, I don't think that's good government. I don't think Dan McKee's he had the chance to answer and he didn't. He just gave the same pat answer. The 2 people on my commission. That's the only people I'm listening to. That's not good enough when you're dealing with a worldwide pandemic. That's not good enough. You know, and a lot else I plan to talk about, and I am just quickly going to run through a few things. Let's let our guest in, and we'll bring him online in just a minute. Chris Carlosi. So again, just to set up the show, we got Chris Carlosi we're gonna bring on live here in just a minute. And then we'll have Dr. Boston coming up in about 15 or 20 minutes. But let me just first let me just share something with you today, kind of on a sad note. I'm shifting gears here. But this is the Park Center. It's very close to where I live. I saw many great movies there. Raiders of the Lost Ark, 2001 Space Odyssey. So when I was a kid growing up in Cranston, 12 years ago or so, Posh Patel took it over, tried to convert it into more of a show theater item. In fact, we saw some great shows there, and plays and whatnot. But I think the COVID was the death knell for it. And now this is what's happening. Now it's abandoned. It's up for auction apparently today. Patel was hinting publicly that maybe there was an angel investor who would save the day, and it ultimately wouldn't be auctioned off. But boy, this COVID, these again, this is my point. These lockdowns that we have now. I mean, if you do any honest analysis, state by state, just like the mask, the lockdowns didn't work. Lockdown states are having no better success than non-lockdown states, and yet businesses like the Park Theater and thousands of others in this state and tens of thousands of others across the country are being shut down, can't get their employees back, all because narratives were the basis of severe public policy, not facts. So it's one of those narratives that we're going to talk about with Christopher Carlosi. Chris, welcome to In the Dugout. How are you today, Chris? Unmute yourself, please.
I'm doing well, Mike. Thank you for having me here today.
All right. Before we get into your credentials and our discussion, you're invited to wear a cap. You got one for me today?
I don't. I'm not a hat guy. I never wear hats, and it's weird. The more hair I lose, the less I wear hats. So
okay.
I went in the opposite direction.
Well, it's only invited and it's only for fun. So thanks for being. So you are the state director in Rhode Island and Massachusetts for NFIB, the National Federation of Independent Businesses. Just very quickly, what is NFIB?
We are a small business advocacy group. We are in every state as well as the capital in DC. We represent small businesses of all types and sizes, various industries, retail, wholesale, hospitality, agriculture, manufacturing, you name them, we represent them. And we have about 500 members throughout Rhode Island and every community. So really that small Main Street business is who we represent.
And I would contend that the Providence Chamber might have more members, but I don't really think of them as a pro-business advocacy group. You do nothing but advocate for pro-business public policy and reforms, right? That's pretty much all you do, right?
We are at in the old days, we were at the State House at hearings, but now virtually doing so. We communicate on any issue that impacts our membership, usually the big issues like taxation, regulations, healthcare, and of course, everything alongside COVID, as well as the labor mandates, which are always coming down the pike fast and furious in Rhode Island. And one of the main things we have to fight back often.
Now, you've talked to your national counterparts. I've talked to my national counterparts. I mean, is it generally NFIB's opinion that these lockdowns have been anti-business and for unnecessary ultimate reasons?
I think getting businesses back open as quickly as possible in a safe way. I mean, business owners don't want any sort of situation in their business. They don't want to see anyone get sick. So they were taking steps throughout the entirety of the pandemic. They were taking every step possible to keep their customers safe, to keep their workers safe. They didn't want to be a headline. So they were ready to safely reopen as soon as they could. they didn't want to be closed down. They didn't want the government restricting what they could and could not do, what they could and could not sell. And for the smaller businesses that I represent, a lot of them were looking out their windows at the big box stores with full parking lots on weekends while they were still waiting to reopen. So there was a real inequity there too, between smaller businesses and some of the larger ones that were allowed to open. I mean, you could buy a shirt in one of those big box stores, but a lot of the small retailers couldn't do that. You could walk around the corner from the grocery section and buy something else, but that small business couldn't open their doors.
The case in Rhode Island that really turned the tide, and it was largely promoted by by Dan York, whose radio show I was just on, was last spring when he learned that, wait a minute, you can buy flowers at Lowe's and Home Depot, but you can't buy them from a flower and vegetable shop. Why not?
And that killed businesses like those small florists when they're losing holidays, when they can't have people walk through those doors. And those businesses don't get the money back. They can't spread it out to states that may have been open. I mean, they have that one location.
All right. Let's before we get, let's not get into anything specific. We will in our next question, but let me ask this. I was hopeful Governor McKee would be would be a much better friend, not just more, a much better friend to the small business community than would Governor Raimondo. After all, as lieutenant governor, I don't know, I think he was tasked with, and he used to hold all these small business forums and listening sessions. I don't know anything that he ever did, but at least he said he was a small business advocate. Now that we're almost 2 months into his reign as governor, does Dan McKee seem like he's the friend to the small business community that he wanted us to think he was?
Well, I think without getting into policy, as you said, we'll get to that later, there are some warning signs that I'm looking at that are particularly concerning. And there are a couple policies that have come up that I take pause and wonder, if these are the actions of someone who is on the side of small business. And just to name them, I guess, without going into them, PPP loans and TCI are two that are particularly concerning right now, and things that are going to heavily impact the operation of businesses in Rhode Island. And to go and proactively do some of these things is not what I would categorize as a friend to small business. We certainly would like to work with the governor moving forward and maybe make sure he's educated on just how much these tech policies do impact small businesses. Maybe he's not aware, but we are a small business advocacy group, and we are going to work on those issues and make sure he is very well educated on the stance of those small employers in the state that I think Rhode Island's going to depend on to recover.
Yeah, but is he going to listen? I mean, we're going to talk about this in a second, but you and a bunch of other business people had a meeting with him last week, and it sounded to me like you were quite discouraged that he wasn't listening to the research. Again, this is what we talked about earlier, with Dan York and Dan McKee. There's research out there that suggests why you should or shouldn't do certain policies, but it seems like the agenda, the narrative is ruling. In this case with McKee, I fear it's the progressive left agenda, it's the climate change agenda, that it doesn't matter what the research is. Did you sense, again, without getting specific, we're going to do that in just a minute, did you sense that this is a governor who is going to consider all sides of the story, or does he is he already committed to these niche special interest agendas?
I would have to say, based on the comments the other day, I'd throw up a couple of red flags as to concerns coming down the road for policies that would inhibit business growth and job growth going forward in Rhode Island. And I know, like you said, it's 2 months into it. So I'd like to keep an open mind going forward, and we will continue to work to advocate for the interests of our membership and remind him what these have real world impacts. They're not just conceptual.
Businesses lost and life savings lost, jobs lost, incomes down. These are big time impacts.
Yeah, and that is what scares me. The comments that were made, we were in a meeting, and some policy issues were thrown out, and I know we'll get into those, but they are concerning. They're issues that are important to my membership. One of the two in particularly right now is very topical. And it's just something that business owners across the country have been worried about. And you're seeing states move in the opposite direction of Rhode Island again. And that's what scares me, because Rhode Island moves in the wrong direction sometimes. When
Right.
every other state zigs, Rhode Island will zag.
Well,
And that's a problem.
that's been, and they never tell us why. It's just all a narrative. Oh, well, more government handouts is better for everybody. And we know that's not true. And we know that hurts the small business sector. All right. I want to quickly get through two things, get to a big thing, the TCI, which we'll get to, and then talk about anything else you want to bring up. Very quickly, the PPP. So he's talking about taxing the PPP loans, at least those loans that were above $150,000. Again, he reiterated in his press conference today, hey, well, it's only these larger companies that are making a lot of money we're now asking to pay their fair share. Oh God, that term, their fair share. You say what to that?
I say that term puts a shiver down my spine every time I hear fair share in whatever context, because it's usually someone else's money, and that's why it's fair. Yeah. And in this case, it's very interesting, because the PPP loan program was meant to keep businesses afloat. It was meant to be a life raft, and now we're poking holes in that life raft with taxation of it. No one intended for this to be a revenue source for the state. These are not big corporations that are getting them. They're very medium-sized businesses. If you're a restaurant and you have a front-end staff, a back-end staff, you've got the people washing dishes, the host. You've got all sorts of people within a restaurant.
You don't have to be that big a company to have qualified for a loan over $150,000. You might be as little as 10 or 12 employees.
That's right. And it's based on salary. The PPP loan, a lot of that was based on paying your workers, keeping them attached to the workforce, using it for some very specific purposes, whether that was paying your workers, paying your rent, paying your utilities. It wasn't that the employers were allowed to use this money for whatever they wanted. It wasn't anything about being profitable. It was keeping workers attached to their jobs so they wouldn't go on unemployment.
And the fact that these larger PPP loan recipients, 150 or more, are only 10% of the group, that doesn't mean those are the most important employers in our state. They employ probably the most people. That 10% above 150 probably employ 30, 40, 50% of the small business employees, and yet they're the one that, I love your analogy. We're going to give you a life raft with a bunch of holes poked in it.
And that's what great analogy. This was meant to keep them going. This was meant to act as a bridge for when you talked about the shutdowns earlier. Well, the businesses had no choice in that matter. They didn't want to close their doors. Yep. They were following the rules. They were helping to stop the spread of the virus by doing this. That was the intention, that you had to close your doors, and then this money came along to keep you going so that you wouldn't be permanently closed or lay your workers off and overwhelm the UI system. And now businesses are going to be punished.
All right, let's move on. Just yes or no, the governor signed, I don't know, maybe it was a month ago, the Act on Climate, which is a long-term capitulation to the environmental far left. Did you support that legislation?
No, we had submitted testimony in both House and Senate versions of the bill opposing what we saw as something that was going to raise energy costs. I mean, Rhode Island already has some of the highest energy costs in the nation. Here we go again, putting manufacturers, people who use high energy use, people who are highly competitive with not just other parts of the country that have lower energy costs, but other parts of the world. And you want these businesses to be able to compete. And now they're going to be dealing with higher energy costs down the line.
So clearly we've increased energy costs down the road. I mean, it's not going to happen immediately. I think that's why a lot of lawmakers felt safe voting for it. Well, by the time these energy costs increase, I'll be out of office. All right, similar, last week, you and I, which I'll show in a minute, you and I were the primary authors of a letter that we got about another 10 or 12 groups to sign on Earth Day last year, asking Governor McKee not to support Governor Raimondo's initiative, which is the Transportation and Climate Initiative. Governor McKee should have no vested interest in this. It was not his program. It's Governor Raimondo's program. This specifically was, and as you talk, I'm going to show the letter. Well, this was our post. I'm going to show the letter because we don't have time to go through it all. But tell us about your discussion with Governor McKee last week with regard to the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or the gas tax, which will put an immediate energy hike on every small business and on every family in our state. Tell us about your discussion.
this was one of the red flags that came up along with PPP in the conversation with the governor last week. And this was asked in that coalition meeting where, a bunch of business groups were in front of the governor and they asked about TCI. And the governor kind of doubled down on it, which I think frightens me. He talked to Governor Baker in Massachusetts. So anybody watching at home who knows anything about TCI, Governor Baker is the one who in Massachusetts who is the tip of the spear on this. Right. He's been pushing it throughout the region, getting others to join, others to oppose it in some states like New Hampshire. And it's really, a policy that takes money out of the state of Rhode Island and gives it to somebody, some bureaucrat to decide what money is spent on these types of projects.
All right, here's the thing that concerned me about what you relayed to me, and correct me if I'm wrong. Now, the left and the environmentalists want you to think that this TCI gas tax is about reducing carbon emissions. But Governor McKee said, I just want the money.
Essentially, that is the message that I received in that conversation, that they want the money that's going to be coming with this, because I think Governor Baker convinced him that if this is going to go forward, you better be with us or you're just not going to get any of the money associated with it because it's going to raise costs anyway. And I think states like New Hampshire would beg to differ with that. And you may see some court cases come out of this going forward if TCI does go forth in a way that will cause other states to, have to implement policies that they may not want, like in New Hampshire, who had put their foot down very early once that first cost analysis came out and they saw what it would cost their residents in gas prices.
And this is the dishonesty of the left, trying to claim this is about environmental benefits, when clearly in our letter, research our centers put out, research many other groups have put out, has shown there is no environmental benefit to a minor decrease in car driving. I mean, they actually want to punish us for driving our cars by raising gas prices so high that we'll drive less, and to restrict the supply available of gas. Let's not forget that. How many of us want to go back to, gas lines like we saw under Jimmy Carter in the 1970s? But the dishonesty of this being all about money. It's always about money.
And you and I, Mike, we know that even we want a clean state. We want a clean environment. We do. But we know that technology improves over time naturally and has. And even when nothing is done, you almost get the same exact result without these punitive taxes if nothing is done at all, just by naturally the free market, the technology improving, cars are becoming cleaner in that time frame. So it's going to happen naturally anyway. But here we are finding a way to tax residents, tax people who have to drive, tax people who have to commute to work, tax businesses that have to deliver goods or provide services.
Exactly right. Now, so if it's only about the money, then just raise the goddamn gas tax a couple of pennies. Why are we giving authority to this third-party group of environmental radicals based in Georgetown University, right? Who not only going to force increases on gasoline, but like I said, they're going to limit the supply of gasoline in our state and in participating states. If you just want the damn money, then just raise the damn gas tax. I mean,
that's what's scary
forget all this interstate compact seating authority stuff. I mean, I don't agree raising the gas tax either, but if it's about the money, why not, right?
Yeah, it's becoming a you jump, I jump sort of thing. And that's what this whole compact is. And that's why they're pressuring those other states to get on board. But you're seeing state by state saying, is this really a good idea? Some states want to go further in their own way, like in New York, and do their own thing. But you did see those states, kind of take pause. And I mean, even in Rhode Island, I know Speaker Mattiello had concerns with it and said it publicly in the press last year, which of course, things have changed now, but that's the whole problem with the whole climate package, that it's ceding control. It's taking away things from accountable individuals who are elected by the people, and putting it in the hand of bureaucrats to make decisions down the line. And that's a problem.
Raising energy costs worsens the business climate. Agreed?
Raising energy costs will hurt manufacturers, hurt people who have to deliver, hurt the workers who have to drive into the workplace. It's less money in their wallet. And
we already have the worst business climate in America, and we're just making it worse. I mean, it's amazing. All right, last question for you. And let's not put all of this on Governor McKee. We have a new governor. We also have a new Speaker of the House. And you just referenced former Speaker Mattiello. Now, he was publicly against the TCI gas tax, and he, at least for the time being, seemed poised to not move that legislation forward. Can you share with us any discussions you might have had with Speaker Mattiello? And B, isn't it true now that under Speaker Shekarchi, we're seeing many, many more radical left, progressive left, big government, anti-business, anti-jobs bills that are going to be moved forward under Speaker Shekarchi than we would have seen under Speaker Mattiello?
Well, I certainly, respected a lot of what Speaker Mattiello did. I never had a conversation with him specifically on TCI, but there were a lot of tax bills where he held the line, and even some of the increases in things like the minimum wage, where it was done in a more incremental way. And I think that, when something comes down the line, you're seeing a lot of these labor bills, and there should be some accountability in the legislature, especially on these environmental bills. There should be a check to the process, and there really isn't right now. And that's what scares me about that climate change bill, that you could have these bureaucrats in the future deciding, people who weren't elected, what mechanisms are in place to meet these carbon goals. And that could include carbon taxes, which technically TCI is, that's a carbon tax. And that, who do you reach out to there? What do you contact? What legislators do you talk to at that point? And it's hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube at that point when it's already out.
Yep.
And then what do you do? So who's going to be responsible? And so you're seeing these bills that are filed. I mean, we've got a minimum wage bill that just made it through committee last night, raising the minimum wage to $15 in 2025. Here you are, struggling businesses, barely keeping their doors open in a pandemic, who had lost revenue all last year, and now we're asking them to increase their minimum wage again. We just increased it last October, if you recall, and now this one will push it to $12.25 at the beginning of next year and raise it over time until it hits $15 in 2025. We don't know what tomorrow looks like. We don't know how slow this recovery is going to be. We're hearing slow. Businesses aren't going to, flip a switch overnight.
Certainly in Rhode Island, with our oppressive policies, it's going to be slow. All right, Chris Carlosi, let's talk more about minimum wage, other bills you have concerns about. Next Thursday, we're hoping to have you on fairly regularly on Thursdays in the first half hour, so we can talk more about these other concerns you have then. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll talk to you next week. And please have a cap ready next week.
I will do that. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, Chris. Talk to you soon. Bye. Thanks. Bye-bye. Chris Carlosi, National Federation of Independent Businesses. He has dual jobs. He covers it for Rhode Island and Massachusetts. He spends, obviously, because it's a much bigger state, more time in Massachusetts, but he's a very prominent, solid voice for the small business community here in Rhode Island, and we look forward to having him back on the show. All right, I see that Andy Boston has entered the dugout, and we will have him live and with you momentarily. I'll just set it up this way. He was, without mentioning his name, he was invoked today by a far left reporter, basically criticizing him for taking a study-based opinion on the effectiveness of mask mandates. He's exercised about that. I'm exercised about my conversation with Dan York, who didn't seem to want to acknowledge reality. Andy, we're like fighting an uphill battle here, but first of all, welcome back to In the Dugout. Oh, Andy, you're muted or something. I don't know. We're not hearing you at all. You're not showing that
we're having the high pitch issue again. I think you got to sign out and sign back in.
All right. We'll let Andy. So let me further set up with Andy. I talked earlier about my discussion with Dan York, who was, I don't know. I felt like the audio he played completely vindicated my position, but Dan York saw it very differently. And I don't even know why we got off on a 20-minute debate about that, which was largely irrelevant. But anyway, he's the host. He can do what he wants. But Dr. Andrew Boston, Bill Bartholomew, who's sometimes guest hosted on WPRO. He's got his own blog, and I think he's on public TV. He's pretty far left guy, although they all try to present themselves as media. He gave one of those suck up, ignorant softball questions to one of the Dr. Chan today, basically saying, oh, Dr. Chan, there's this doctor who claims he's an epidemiologist who's running around saying that mask mandates aren't that effective. You know, what do you have to say to that? I mean, is that weak? I mean, how weak was that question? Was that delivery? And of course, Dr. Chan just gave the same, while Dr. Boston in our post today cited research, cited data as to why they don't work. All they could give was some general, well, yeah, we've known for a long time that masks work.
Are we back? Can you hear me?
Andy, now we got you. What first, let's talk about the presser today and the bill.
One second, Mike. One second, Mike.
Okay. Okay, got some domestic.
Sun's off to gallivanting. So
good.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. So Mike, the first thing, let me just say, when some cannabis clown, invokes my name I don't care. I mean, I'm surprised the guy knows where he is looking at his website, but the issue, I was very upset, Mike, and I really have to say this. I was very upset by what I just listened to, and I couldn't hear it all because actually Matt Allen called me during your interview with Dan York. It was awful what he did to you, and I just want to say that this is a real problem to have a person like him on the radio that gets so much attention, and he's so absolutely close-minded, and what he said about as if, because here's what's actually happening, and Mr. York, you should understand this. I know you have certain difficulties, but this is very clear, Mr. York. Mr. York, what we put out in that presser and what I've talked about, and you're right, Mr. York, I tried to educate you about this for almost an hour on your own show. Those are not my theories. I have nothing to do with the information that I presented to you or that we summarized today. Mr. York, those are called randomized controlled trials. I had nothing to do with them. The Center for Freedom and Prosperity had nothing to do with them. But they are, in fact, the gold standard for evidence when you reach what's called equipoise. You really don't know whether something works or not. Now, I've been a clinical trialist and ran the largest clinical trial ever conducted in kidney transplant recipients out of the state of Rhode Island. And there we reached a different question, and we were in equipoise about a certain therapy. You could argue that the equipoise about masks was reached back during the early 2000s period when there was pandemic planning, primarily for flu. That was what was really the concern.
And the consensus back then was?
And again, it was equipoise. The evidence up to that point was, it might work. Oh, we've got some issues in hospitals where maybe it's helping. But they really didn't know. Now, the idea was this going to be applied in community settings? That was the whole question, Mr. York. That was the whole question. So between 2008 and 2016, 10 consecutive randomized controlled trials of masking in the community in various different settings. At universities, studies were conducted randomized by dormitory, in household contacts of people who are actively infected with influenza. There were 3 such studies. There was a pilot study of Hajj patients.
All right. So let me just ask this. So I get it.
Collectively, there were 10 studies, Mike.
Okay. There were 10 studies.
Each one individually was negative.
All right, hold on. Hold on.
No, but Mr. York has to understand this because he's thick and he's nasty.
All right, let's not go there.
But that's where it is, Mike.
I want to ask you this. You're a studied guy. Have you ever seen, and if the answer is yes, tell me. I mean, because sometimes there's conflicting studies, right? That present conflicting data. Are you aware of any widely cited gold standard study that shows that mask mandates do work?
Absolutely not. Not in this
Not
period.
a single one.
Dealing with respiratory viruses and randomized controlled trials. Observational trials, which are fraught with biases that you cannot eliminate. You can try to statistically after the fact, That's the whole reason we do randomized controlled trials. No, between 2008 and 2020, we had that period from 2008 to 2016 where there were 10 negative studies. They were rather small. So what the CDC, well, actually not the CDC, but its House journal published a meta-analysis of those 10 studies. They actually pooled them together. And this was published as SARS had emerged already in May of 2020. These 10 individual negative studies, Mr. York, were pooled and published in the House journal of the CDC called Emerging Infectious Diseases because they thought maybe a small effect was missed because something called statistical power was not adequate in these individual studies.
All right.
Even pooling them together, they were negative.
All right.
But also for Mr. York, after that happened, when the question about SARS-CoV-2 and masking was still in play, a test of the hypothesis of masking specifically for SARS-CoV-2 was completed, Mr. York, in Denmark and with 6,000 patients, and it was negative.
But it's not Mr. York I'm concerned about.
I am concerned about
I'm
it.
concerned about the public because Dan York doesn't make public policy. Dan McKee makes public policy. And he listens to
but it's like this.
Hold on. He listens
like
to
this.
Dr. Jha. He listens to this Dr. Chan who gave that ridiculous answer today. He listens to Nicole Alexander Scott. And you're telling us,
and they ignore the evidence, and this is the problem, Mike.
Right.
They ignore the randomized controlled trial evidence.
You're telling us that as much as they claim it's about the science, that there's not one credible scientific study other than
specifically randomized controlled trial, which again is our gold standard for interventions. Okay,
that is your claim that they are basing their policies on a false.
I'd be happy to be informed that I missed since 2008 when these issues became pressing a positive randomized controlled trial because first of all, the CDC's own House journal pooled them all together and said they were negative, not only individually, but collectively. And then since then, there's only been 2 large randomized controlled trials. Now, you have to remember that pooling together the data only amounted to 6,000 subjects. Well, there was another huge Hodge Pilgrim study, which was published in October, which alone was 6,500 patients. It was actually conducted pre-COVID era, but it took so long to pool and analyze the data.
The evidence is overwhelming, right? It's overwhelming.
It was not only negative, Mike. There was a suggestion that those randomized to masks by tent at the Hajj, remember, it's in Mecca, it's the pilgrims, they actually had a higher infection rate. And it didn't quite reach statistical significance, but it was up to 40% higher. And after that was published was the specific study involving COVID-19, another 6,000 patients. It was also negative. That's the body of evidence, Mike.
We get it.
That's the body of evidence.
Let's look at some Rhode Island data here. So this is the chart you sent me that your team made.
It ends at the end of March. I haven't been able to update it.
All right, that's okay. So let's look at this point right here. So we extend on November 2nd.
Right.
The Raimondo extends the mask mandate yet again. And on November 5th, November 5th, she extends it. But 3 days early, it was shown that Rhode Islanders, the compliant Rhode Islanders we are, the sheeple that we are, we had the 96% conformity with wearing masks, the highest in the country.
The question, Mike,
let me just clarify. What did that do to the incidence of the spread? What did it do?
Well, even Dan York should be able to see what happened. But the bottom line is, Mike, the question was very specific in that survey. It was, how often do you wear the mask when you go out? And it was 96% of the time, every time people went out of the house in Rhode Island. So we were the most compliant state in the country in this survey of all 50 states.
So not only
so you see this peak, Mr. York, these 2 peaks, they're appearing after.
It's directed to Mr. McKee, Governor McKee, but not only does all the national, international research show that mask mandates are ineffective, but Rhode Island data in our own state shows that it's
Well,
ineffective.
but Mike, here's the problem. This is why these are the data that I guess they're invoking in terms of these are observational data. Here's an observational data which would suggest that masks don't work. But show that figure again, please. I just want to show you what kind of chicanery goes on. Can Larry put that figure up again, please?
Here you go.
Well, let's say you pick your starting point over here. Oh, and then you stop it over here. Oh, masks work. That's the problem with observational data. And in fact, the CDC did exactly that. They actually had a study that allegedly showed in Kansas, an observational study, when Kansas's mask mandate went in place, somewhere around the peak. Oh, look what happened at the end of the summer. And then they cut the study off. But Kansas did exactly what we did. If you extended the study out where the mask mandate was still in place to the fall winter peak, you got pretty much the same thing, maybe not quite as high. And this is the problem with observational data.
And we've shown on this show many times the chart your team also put up of other states and other counties and other states with mask mandates compared with those without. And as it turns out, not only is there very little difference, but any differences seem to say that you're better off without a mask mandate.
But Mike, the larger point is the reason we do randomized controlled trials is then you're controlling for time period too. You're not. It's called confounding to be biased by all these factors. And the point is that there's a monolith of evidence that says in randomized controlled trial settings of community masking in all these different iterations, it didn't work.
All right, let me show you this, which I think you'll applaud. So this is Governor Henry McMaster in South Carolina.
Right.
The whole point of getting the vaccine was to get back to normal. We now have 3 vaccines available, and South Carolinians can get one. Local cities and counties need to drop any remaining restrictions they have in place. It's time to wrap this up, or I will do it for them. Now, that's a governor who's aware of the real data, right? And acting properly on that data. And
at the local level, Mike, I can tell you a very reassuring story. I believe it's out of Colorado, where the local school board was replaced, both politically and physically. And the new school board got rid of the mask mandate because they weren't responding to the needs and the demands of the community.
All right. I'm going to shift gears and talk about vaccines. So we per our post today, we hope Dan York reads our post. We hope Governor McKee.
I doubt it. He doesn't seem to want to read. So that's okay.
We've put out, that's all we can do. We've put out the actual data. We've backed up our claims with research and data, and they have not. How do we have confidence in their public policy decisions when they don't tell us what data and what sources they're basing their decisions on?
And the operative word, Mike, is data. These are not theories of me or you or anyone else. These are data. There's a difference between data and theories, Mr. York.
All right. So before I move on to vaccines, I just want to remind those who are listening, this is what you're going to get on this show. Honest truth, honest opinions based on actual research, data, and opinions you're not going to hear anywhere else. And I just got blasted by one of the most popular talk show hosts, but for 50 minutes, he tried to blast me. I think I stayed calm. I think I made my case, but that's my job, is to stand firm for the truth, for the principles that we believe in, and take the arrows for freedom. This is what our center is about. This is what this show is about. This is what Dr. Boston is about. And I want you to tune in, because whatever the issue is going to be, you're going to get the unvarnished, principled truth from us, even if it goes against the status quo government narrative and all the cronies and all the swamp that supports them.
Well, I just have to say, Mike, when the late great Sovietologist, the chronicler, the grisly, gruesome chronicler of mass murder in the Soviet Union, Robert Conquest, who was also a poet, an incredible historian, and had the tenacity to publish books like The Great Terror and Harvest of Sorrow about the Ukrainian terror famine. He pointed out that at a certain stage, the evidence was so overwhelming of Soviet totalitarian atrocities, and that the people that refused to see it, he called them impenetrable by fact. I think that's what we're dealing with.
Yep. Okay. Similar on vaccines. Now, let me take a minute to set this up and then give you a comment. I got a couple of things I want to share, and then we'll get your comment. Now, this has to do with the mandatory sports testing that's taken place in our state. And in a minute, we're going to get to these coerced vaccines. In a minute, we're going to get to that. So we got two more issues to cover in the next 10 minutes here. First of all, so it was it was speculated that COVID itself caused some kind of heart disease, right, or problems among athletes.
Myocarditis.
This data I'm looking at, hold on. This data I'm looking at now shows maybe it wasn't as bad as we first thought. But what we are seeing now is that maybe in younger people who are taking the vaccine, or at least the Pfizer vaccine, that maybe heart problems are being caused by the vaccine. And yet we're mandating in schools, which we'll talk about in a minute, that almost coercing kids in schools to take that, and they're all under 30. Your comments on all that, doctor?
So first of all, let me clarify on the relationship between the disease itself, COVID-19,
yep,
and myocarditis. It absolutely can occur. As it can occur with a whole range of viruses, both gastrointestinal viruses and particularly respiratory viruses, including influenza. There was an analysis done that was published about 15 years ago now, I believe, that showed that in terms of hospitalized patients, very sick patients with influenza, up to 10% could have some evidence of myocarditis. So we know this. Viruses are capable of causing myocarditis. The issue that was being singled out was what happens to, and those are, by and large, they're not typically healthy people. The issue that you're talking about was specifically this I think at this point now, overwrought concern that garden variety, very healthy college athletes, right, had to be segregated
right,
and constantly tested because there was something unique about this virus that was going to predispose, right, them to an excess.
And that's been dispelled, right? That's pretty much been dispelled, right?
That's what's so.
Right, well, let's get to the vaccines. What about the vaccines causing potential heart?
Okay, issues? So what's different? And by the way, you don't go out and infect yourself with SARS-CoV-2 and just hope that, hey, I'm a healthy person and I'm not going to get sick, including myocarditis. Okay, that's a very you get it by transmission inadvertently. So that's very different than being vaccinated. Which is ostensibly a voluntary process. So there's a tremendous difference right off the bat. What's happened, and we have to be aware of denominators, Mike. It's very important. There are reports now, bona fide reports, of an association between vaccination with the mRNA vaccines and myocarditis,
which is heart inflammation.
And right, exactly. And they'll always lag behind. But what I can tell you is that in Israel, they've reported so far 62 cases, 2 of which were fatal, and they're preponderantly in people under 40. And that's where the concern is.
With the vaccine. With the
mRNA vaccine there, which was the Pfizer vaccine.
All right, what about this U.S. data here?
And hang on a second, I'll get to that. I want to deal with the issue of myocarditis. And you have to realize that the concern here is we're always trying to balance risks. People less than 40, certainly less than 30, are at very low risk from any serious complication from COVID. So even a small background event, which this is, which the myocarditis from the vaccines is, becomes unacceptable. at a certain point, and we have to establish where that point is. But there's been 62 cases in Israel, two of which were fatal, and the fatal cases were in people less than 30, a woman and a man so far. In the United States, in the vaccine adverse event reporting system, this is the same system. I'll get to these data that you have up. I found that there were 47 bona fide associations in the database in total. 2/3 of them were in people less than 40. And then today, because of this issue of vaccinating high school kids, I went down to the separate age bracket that includes the small number of kids that are in high school that have been vaccinated. So it's basically the bracket between 6 and 17. Well, there's 2 cases of myocarditis, pericarditis. So the not only the heart muscle itself, but the sac that the heart sits in, the pericardium. It's called myopericarditis. There's 2 cases in one in a 16-year-old and one in a 17-year-old male that have been dumped into the system. Again, Mike, it's going to take a lot of work to tease out whether this is a true causal relationship, but these associations
But there are
exist.
some questions, right? Legitimate questions.
Legitimate questions. Now, if you want to show me that slide again, put that back up again. This is an analysis that I did this week to look broadly at the United States. Can we show that again? Okay, so I wanted to look at the relationship between just associated hospitalizations, associated deaths in the same adverse event reporting system. It's that the CDC has put together. It's called the Vaccine Event Reporting System, and so we have the data for COVID, and the number of hospitalizations was just so much higher. This is for 18 to 29-year-olds. And I did the best I could to show that we're not dealing with different numbers of population, different numbers of vaccinations. So there were, at the time I did this, I think there were 8.4 million that had gotten the COVID vaccine. Each one of these years, it looks like somewhere in approximately about 10 million got the flu vaccine, maybe a little less, but very comparable numbers. In other words, we're not dealing with totally different denominators. But what's striking is that, and these are full years, okay? But what's striking is that in this short period of time, and it's been a very intense immunization process.
4 months, yeah.
Yeah, even in this age group. But again, so it's done at a more relaxed pace with the flu vaccines. But the total numbers in terms of people vaccinated are probably very close, and it just jumps out at you. Now, Mike, remember though, and I don't want to alarm people. The denominators for these groups are like 8 to 10 million. So 8 to 10 million, even with 317 hospitalizations, is a small number. But look at it relative to the flu vaccine, and you could still argue that in this age group, certainly in the less than 18, the flu can often be more devastating than COVID. So it's just disproportionate, Mike, no matter how you look at it. Can we look at the other slide? Larry's got the other slide.
I don't have another slide for you. So just.
Oh, okay. Well, I actually went and expanded it to the 18 to 49-year-olds.
Oh, okay.
And that. Oh yeah. And here I pulled out the numbers from the U.S. Census and the percentage of people vaccinated each year for the flu. And these are the approximate numbers. So again, if you look at partially vaccinated with the COVID vaccine, it's a little higher. But then if you look at fully vaccinated, it's a little lower. So again, just to show people looking at this slide that the denominators are approximately the same. And once again, Mike, when you expand this now, and it's still a relatively low risk group for COVID, you're going out to 49 years old. It's just disproportionate, no matter how you slice it, Mike. I mean, let's just simplify it. So when we hear government officials, when we're going to talk about the next time, we hear school district officials, or I guess are government officials, just pushing
everybody to take a vaccine like it's drinking a glass of water, that is medical negligence, because there are some risks. We talk about informed consent. At least tell, since it is a choice for people right now, still, hopefully it will remain a choice. We need informed. We can't just cavalierly and indiscriminately say everybody go get this vaccine, right? I mean, that's medical malpractice.
Mike, that's what I've been saying since before the vaccines were released, that I hope it's a targeted strategy towards the highest risk. And this is exactly why. So there's two things. The vaccines are still under emergency use authorization. And going back to the statute, we've talked about this before. The statute is explicit that it's got to be voluntary, and that the alternative, in other words, usually it's a drug. So the alternative treatment has got to be described. Well, in the case of a vaccine, what is the alternative? The alternative really is, have you been previously infected with SARS-CoV-2 and recovered? Now, if that's not part of the consent process, it's a terribly flawed consent, and I'm not aware of this. This should be upfront, and then the person should be counseled. Well, wait a minute. If you had a bona fide syndrome, you lost your sense of smell. God forbid you wound up in the hospital and were diagnosed, with COVID. You tested positive a couple of times. You had antibody testing that was done. Some bona fide infection that should be part of the pre-vaccination consent process. And then the person should say, and then the administrator should be educated to say, look, the data show that the immunity that you were conferred by your clear-cut infection is probably as good as what we can give you from the vaccine. And then we still have this unaddressed question of are you at more risk, particularly if you were just getting over it. Right. But Mike, there's a very important point here.
All right, and this is also for Mr. York. Wrap up with this point. Go ahead.
This is also for Mr. York. Israel just released data this week, and it was incredibly gutsy of the investigators, because Israel is vaccine central. They had a 6.4 million person database, but in that database, they were able to isolate out a very interesting group of 188,000 who had never been vaccinated and had been infected with SARS-CoV-2 in their first wave, and now were followed forward in time up to 6 to 9 months, and compare them to all the various groups of vaccinated controls. They found, first of all, that there was no difference in terms of reductions in infections, hospitality, and mortality comparing this vaccine-naive group followed longitudinally. And in fact, in the vaccine-naive group, and it's small compared to the total of 6.4 million, it's 188,000, there was one death in follow-up in an 80-plus-year-old person. That was the only death. So, and they concluded, again, these are Israeli investigators bucking the tide in their country, saying we see no rationale for vaccinating previously infected people. That was the conclusion of their report.
All right.
Okay, so that's the evidence that's out there, Mike.
All right, great data. Again, thank you for your time on the show. Thank you for the research you put into the post we put up today that we hope people with blinders on will look at, even though that hope is dashing.
Yeah, and this I have to dedicate this show not only to you, Mike, but also to Dan York. Okay.
All right. Well, all right.
Take care.
All right. Thanks, Andy. So, wow, what a day. It's not often you get excoriated on statewide radio by a very popular talk show host. But that's my job. It's what we do here at the center. It's what we talk about here on this show. Now, I want to extend what you just heard from Dr. Boston about vaccines not necessarily being for everybody. I want to talk about the issue, because we had parents on yesterday, that the governor is so proud of. And it's, again, to me, I'm not a doctor, but I can listen and learn from doctors like Dr. Boston and others I listen to, and I read constantly on this stuff. that just indiscriminately pushing vaccines on young people in high schools, setting up clinics where they're going to be coerced in their classrooms, in the halls, on the athletic fields, into taking tests or getting shots in the arm, and just indiscriminately doing it without, like Dr. Bossum said, without any knowledge of their medical history, whether they've had the vaccine, whether they have some other condition or not, which is exactly why parental consent must be obtained before we start jabbing high school kids in the arm without parental consent. A parent might be aware. I mean, picture the scenario. Let's assume a child just had COVID and just recovered. So a lot of data shows you could be at risk if you get a vaccine right on the onset of that. And let's say a parent says, listen, Jane, when you go to school next week, don't sign up for one of those COVID tests because our doctor has said, we've talked to our doctor and they said, you might be at risk of don't get the vaccine. Well, under peer pressure from that school, that child could sign up for that vaccine and put themselves at risk in getting that vaccine without their parents' consent, even if their parent might have indicated to them otherwise. This is not reasonable, folks. This mad dash to get every shot in the arm possible as fast as is not informed consent. Do you remember? I mean, for virtually every medicine you see on TV, virtually every procedure you ever hear about, it's consult with your doctor before doing X procedure, right? There's none of that in this. There's no consult with your doctor here. It's, hey, get this medical procedure, boom. Where is the due diligence? Where is the medical history? Where is the informed consent in any of this? This is crazy, folks. I don't understand this. That we just don't understand. It goes against every norm we've ever practiced in this country. And this governor and this president and these health experts ignoring medical norms is just unthinkable to me. And media talk show hosts on the radio who don't get that, it's unthinkable to me. And it is to you too. That's why you've tuned in. So you keep watching on this show. We'll be back next Tuesday. We're not done with this. We're going to be talking more with parents groups who are outraged at what their kids are being forced and coerced into doing. We'll be talking more with them. There's a lot more to come. There's some legal angles being developed. We'll update you on all that. And again, on this show and in the Dugout, subscribe if you haven't done that yet. Tell your friends about us. You're going to get unvarnished, straight from the hip talk here. You're not going to get anywhere else. So we will see you next week. I thank you for turning in. And for In the Dugout, Mike Stenhouse.